Commissioner, thank you so much for joining the KidsXpress Village today. And obviously we were meant to have a very different circumstance in terms of we were having an event hosted by Macquarie Bank. Huge number of the KidsXpress Village wanted to be there, but I know that they will be watching our interview or our time together today with great interest. So I'm so grateful for you making the time for us today.
Oh, look, you're most welcome, and in this awful era of COVID-19 pandemic, it's changing the lives of all of us, and this is just one of the very real examples.
Yes, absolutely. Jane, I'm going to start with one thing that's occurring to me at the moment is how sick are you of the word unprecedented? Because that just seems to be a word that at the beginning of the year I didn't particularly enjoy that much, and it just seems to be permeating our whole year. So I'm just wondering on your thoughts on that word at the moment.
It's funny you say that, because during this fire season, when I was asked questions about how peculiar the season was, how unusual the season was, I said it was unprecedented. I indicated that we had not experienced what we were experiencing before. So I've noticed a few commentators later in the fire season or at the end of this fire season were starting to take issue with the word unprecedented, and I said to them, I said, well, if it hasn't happened before and we haven't experienced it before, it is unprecedented. So what is the alternate word? And the reality is what we experienced this year, particularly in the fire season event, weather conditions like we've not experienced before, fire danger rating conditions, fire danger levels like we hadn't seen before, a longevity of the fire season uninterrupted by weather, uninterrupted by fire behaviour, a damage toll, and tragically a death toll like we've never experienced before in New South Wales. It had a profound effect on the state of New South Wales, and then you overlay on top of that now this unprecedented impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is a 1920 season of firsts. We're in uncharted territory, and we're all working through as a nation, as a state of New South Wales with the bushfires and other parts of Australia with the bushfires, but this COVID-19 is not just affecting local communities, the state of New South Wales, Australia. It's a truly global challenge.
Absolutely. So Shane, and thank you for letting me call you Shane. But from the whole New South Wales, from the country, big congratulations on your new role. It does feel incredibly fitting to me and many of my other colleagues that you now have resilience in your official title. During the bushfires, and we know that throughout this period now and ahead of us, you've been praised for your leadership during the crisis and how we all looked towards you for that leadership. And it feels like obviously you're going from one crisis straight into another crisis. And what I'm really curious about is in terms of what I guess your career, but specifically what happened with the bushfires over at the beginning of the year. What learnings from that are you bringing into COVID-19 and into your new role in Resilience New South Wales?
Oh wow, that's a big question. That's a big question. And look, I think really resilience in the definition around building community resilience for disasters and emergencies really centres around a definition with the words of the effect that would say, how well do we plan ourselves? How well do we prepare ourselves and see through disasters or disruptions or emergencies, be disrupted, be damaged, be affected, and then ultimately how quickly do we bounce back to some normality, to some new normality, or very rarely a pre-existing the disaster normality. So resilience is about so many things when you look at that continuum, planning, contemplating, preparing ourselves, working through the disaster or the event, but then particularly rebuilding and recovering from that event. And there is so much in that. First and foremost, there's the human dimension, which is obvious because it's all around people. But then when most people look at damage, destruction, and particularly recovery and rebuilding, it is all about the physical stuff. It's all about, obviously, people's homes, people's livelihoods, people's properties, but it's also about community. It's about everything from transport corridors, roads, bridges. It's other community buildings. It's churches, schools, halls, all your power supply, your utilities, power poles, power infrastructure, water supply things. So we get the built environment and rebuilding all those physical things, which is difficult enough in the true sense of the word. But what we often don't talk about is the psychological and emotional well-being of everybody, and how do we better prepare people for disruption? You know, we get into a groove, we get into life as we know it, and how we expect things to happen. And we're all of a different predisposition in any case. We've all got personal experiences. We've all got personal links with family and community and what have you. So we're all a bit different as we're going into a disaster or into a disruptive event. And the same would be said for communities. Even though we're all attached to communities in some way, we're all a bit different. So acknowledging that we're all a bit different as we lead into a disaster, then the same logic applies when we get out the other side of the disaster. So we're all, and a disaster particularly like a bushfire or even like the COVID pandemic that's running out, in a bushfire, some of us will be directly affected. You know, we will have lost loved ones. Some of us will have lost our livelihood. Some of us will have lost our homes. Some of us will have been there and been frightened. Others would have been away and felt guilty because they weren't there. Other people, in a street of 10 homes, we see 8 destroyed, and you get 2 people where their homes have survived. They feel really guilty that why are they the 2 in the street that survived? So you've got all these different experiences that people have during the disaster. And such is the case after the disaster, when everyone's sitting there saying, wow, the disaster's finished, the bushfire's moved on, it's now rained, but look at what's left here. I mean, what are we going to do? How are we going to get there? What next? And everybody's experience, everybody's situation then, everybody's want for support, for connectedness, for conversation, for professional support is very, very different. And the challenge is in building that resilience, how do we accommodate all that? How do we accommodate the natural environment, the built environment, the infrastructure, and most importantly, the people in their communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So therefore, going to this new role, this need for recovery and healing, and as you say, providing all that support and all that services, I imagine that's going to be a huge part of your new role as you work out who does what and how we access that. And there's never been, obviously, a more critical time to think about the process out the other side. Obviously, we're in COVID-19 now, but there is out the other side. And from an organisation very focused on children's mental health, we are very concerned about the now for children, but in particular for children out the other side, given we have adverse childhood experiences, which we already know put children at risk. And then with bushfires and COVID is going to add to that. So, you know, really appreciating that we have put importance in terms of that recovery and how we support communities, individuals, families in their uniqueness around Absolutely. Who they are as individuals. And I think that's really important and so wonderful to hear from you. I'd like to explore a little bit that you as a leader and you display such depth and fortitude in your mental strength during the bushfires. I'm sure it wasn't always easy. And no. You lead a massive team of 70,000 strong crew of volunteers, and they would all have a range of different skills, ages, and you know their own situations going on. They're losing their own homes. And yet you repeatedly and effectively, and I say effectively kind of loosely, in terms of the effectiveness was really brought through with your empathy and your compassion for everybody that you came into contact, whether that was through a camera or in person. And I'm really curious about that because I'm almost wondering as a leader what your secret is. How do you develop that mental fitness, resilience, but that depth of empathy and compassion that you can then deliver to such a wide, broad group of people?
Look, that's a very good question, Margo. And what I suppose my answer to that is, I think in any organisation, particularly for leaders at whatever level, so we're all leaders at different levels of whatever we're involved with. It's a volunteer organisation or a salaried organisation. But as a leader, I think what cuts through everything else is authenticity. authenticity and credibility. And what I mean by that is being self-aware, accepting who you are, accepting your limitations, understanding where your strengths might be, but most importantly, being truthful and honest with yourself and what's going on around you. And I think there's nothing wrong in that authenticity space of always trying to be a better you, working on it, learning from others, gaining insights from others, studying, experiencing whatever it is you're doing, but not being false, not putting up a facade or filling a gap with what you don't know and pretending you know. Authenticity cuts through everything. So being authentic then directly correlates. Being authentic, I think, directly then correlates with being honest and being humble. So ultimately, in a role like mine, particularly as the commissioner through the bushfire event or the events of this season, is I've got a role to do, but it's not actually about me. So yes, I've got the role to do. I've got very significant responsibilities, and I've got an organisation to look after. I've got a massive firefighting effort to ensure that we're coordinating. We've got a public interest, saving life, saving property as much as we can. We've got responsibilities for trying to get clear, concise, timely, accurate information and warnings out to the community, all those sorts of things. So there is absolute responsibility, but I've got to do that as a role. I've got to take that role seriously, but not take myself too seriously. So if that kind of makes sense. I think the other important thing is at whatever level, but then it's amplified. And all these things I'm talking about, I think are spotlighted when you're in crisis. When the crisis is happening on, I think the leadership traits are inherent, but I think they come to the fore during crisis. And the other things I would think about are, for goodness sake, making decisions and taking action. Critical all the time. People get really disenfranchised if leaders procrastinate and won't make a decision and talk the talk but don't actually take the action. And you don't have that time or luxury during a crisis. You've got to be making decisions with what information you've got, taking the right actions. And I think ultimately the final two things I would talk about is absolutely respect. You've got to respect the views and opinions of others. You've got to have that mutual respect arrangement. And the example I use is when I was a kid growing up, my mum very much instilled into me and my sisters as children, and it has stuck with me for life. And it's the old phrase, manners cost you nothing, but the lack of them can cost you everything. And it is absolutely appropriate to be polite, to be respectful, to be well-mannered, to be considerate. And I put that in a big bunch of manners. But as we come into adult life and we're particularly working with people in organisations, in volunteer organisations, in business, or whatever it is we're doing, I think manners translates to respect and mutual respect. So as long as we can always be respectful of one another, respectful of diversity, respectful of the need to include, respectful of the fact that you don't always have the answers, being honest with yourself, that you're relying on others to work together. So for me, I think that has really helped me work with a large volunteer organisation that I've always regarded everyone I've worked with as equals. So I put myself as a leader amongst equals. I don't value myself as any better or more important than anybody else. We've all just got different jobs to do. Yeah. And then I think ultimately in all that interaction, for any leader, and I've always taken this very seriously, I don't think it's talked about enough, is the word care, C-A-R-E. So we do have to care about what we're doing and why we're doing it, but most importantly, we've got to genuinely care about who's infected, who's affected, I should say, and who's involved. So in the bushfire environment, absolutely, I had lots of care for the men and women that were every day just giving of themselves, saving life, saving property, trying to save and protect as much as they could, and they stood up day after day, week after week, month after month. Of course, the volunteers were central to that, but there was all their salaried counterparts, and it was an army of men and women, paid fire services, emergency services, police, the army, every state and territory of the country, New Zealand, America, Canada. They all came to help us. So there was a genuine care about their welfare, their safety, their capacity to manage fatigue and endurance during the fire, but also it was also the care about everybody that was being impacted and affected by these fires. So communities, you know, right up and down the Great Dividing Range. It was massive. So for me, I think basic leadership traits are really important in crisis. But I think what happens is they get spotlighted very much. There's a magnifying glass that's put over them. And I think the big word that trumps everything is authenticity. And then it's rounded off at the bottom with care. So you've got to be genuinely authentic about who you are and what you're there for. You've got to be able to work through all those sorts of things with sympathy, with empathy, be decisive, be authoritative when you need to be. But ultimately, you're doing it in a very respectful way. And you're doing it without ego, but you're doing it with focus because you actually care about what you're trying to achieve, if that makes sense.
Oh, Shane, that makes perfect sense. And, you know, I have to say you're also speaking KidsXpress language. Care is one of our values that we hold very close to us in terms of how we care for children, how we care for parents and carers, and how we care for our even our teachers at the moment who are still in our schools caring for those frontline children or children of the frontline workers is so incredibly important. And I think when we as authentic leaders, as leaders try to be authentic, the care of people, that I think is the one thing that if it's not genuine, it's so obvious. And I would again absolutely commend you, because I think Australia felt very cared for by you during that whole process, or no, I shouldn't call it process, that time through the bushfires. I think every time I personally watched you, I felt like I was in very safe hands. And that word care did actually come up a lot in conversation with colleagues and with friends around the care that you took. And that kind of leads me to my next question. In terms of your predecessor, Phil Coburg, is that how I say it?
Phil Coburg, yes. Yeah.
So he actually said at the time that you can understand the full depth of grief felt by those who've lost their loved ones to the fires when many of us cannot. And when I think about that, and I will be honest, like many, many people in Australia and probably across the world, as we watched you deliver eulogies at funerals of those brave firefighters that lost their lives, and particularly when you spoke to the children, albeit very little children, but the care and sensitivity. And I would also say how thoughtful you had constructed your words to them. I think for all of us, I wouldn't say brought us to our knees, but made us all realise how vulnerable life really is and how important those messages are, because those children are what you said on those days is going to be repeated to them, and they'll repeat it to themselves as they grow. So for me, I wonder whether the question here is that depth of understanding that Phil made reference to around grief and loss. And obviously many of our children, many of us are going through grief and loss now of all different varieties, but we are losing people during COVID-19. That depth and that empathy and that knowledge, where in your life does that come from? Because I don't think that's what you did during that time wasn't textbook. It was very, very authentic, and like I said, with such care.
Wow, that's another big question, Margo. And what I would say is a couple of things. First and foremost, there is no textbook for that sort of thing. Absolutely, there's no script. I think so much of engaging with people and linking in with grief and those that are grieving profound loss is a very sacred space. Is a very unique and individual space. And as I said publicly during the fires, I will be forever grateful and feel a great sense of privilege that when we lost our firefighters in the most awful of accidents, that in the middle of the night, in the early hours of the morning, I'm talking post midnight, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, when we were going back to the partners' homes and knocking on the door to talk to them about their loss, they opened the door and they let us in. And we had conversations, heartfelt conversations. It's a very sacred time, and it's something that will stick with me forever. But I think, like everybody, and it starts with kids. I think loss, grief, sadness is a natural part of life. We form that. We understand, you know, I remember as a kid losing my favourite pets, my dog and the cat, and having to go through that mourning process and going through and understanding loss and then loved ones in family and friends and all that sort of thing. But I think what Phil was talking about particularly was after 30 odd years with the organisation, I had seen colleagues in the organisation suffer serious injury and loss of life over the years with firefighting. But I also saw the loss of my own father. My own father was involved in a prescribed burning activity, a hazard reduction burning activity, which in any routine set of circumstances is considered a fairly benign activity that should be executed without issue, no injury, and certainly no loss of life. But sadly, back on the 8th of June 2000, my dad, along with some fellow crew, he was working with National Parks at the time. He's a volunteer for as long as I can remember, but he was also with National Parks doing fire management work. And there was a crew that were out doing a prescribed burn, not very far from where I live actually. And something went horribly wrong on the day, and the fire turned around and enveloped them and burnt over them. And tragically, 3 people died on the mountain that day after their horrific burn injuries, and my dad was one of them. And another fellow passed away in hospital a month later, and 3 people live with physical and emotional scars as a result of that day. So, and I spent a lot of time with families, my own family, but also families that lost their loved ones on that day. And I continue to catch up with the survivors of that awful day to this day, as I've seen them, you know, develop further through life and start their own families and whatever. So I think there's no doubt that I learnt a lot and appreciated a lot through that personal experience, that very deeply personal experience that rocked our family. And I was an assistant commissioner at the time, and I can say honestly that I weighed up whether I was even in the right business. If something like that could happen to my dad, you know, what are we in this business for? And I remember it didn't last very long, that thought process, and I said to myself, no, we can't let this happen again. We've got to do everything we can to stop it. And the only way you can really do that is being part of the solution, not sitting back on the sideline, pontificating and, you know, saying you've got all the answers, but not actually being there and being held accountable. So there's no doubt I've got some background. Others will have far more relevance than me. But I think also as a leader and a leader of emergency services, and during this fire event, there's a burden of command, as we kind of call it. There's a real sense of responsibility that weighs heavily on your shoulders for every one of those people that are out there on the fire line, on the fire front, doing their thing in the most awful and dangerous of circumstances. You feel very responsible, necessarily so, for the decisions you're taking, the leadership you're providing, the guidance you're showing about their welfare, their safety and what have you. And when you lose somebody on that fire ground, and we lost 3 aviators that were out here helping us when their large aeroplane crashed down in the high country near Cooma there. And we lost 3 volunteer firefighters in horrific accidents. 2 of them, Jeff and Andrew, were killed when a tree fell down on their truck while they were driving down the road, and they were killed instantly. And then the 3rd volunteer, Sam, down near the Victorian border, just to the east of Albury there, an extraordinary weather event, flipped over his 10-ton truck. It lifted it off the ground, flipped it over, and he was working on the back of the truck, and he was killed instantly when he was crushed. So I feel a deep sense of responsibility, you know, for that loss, even though logic would tell you they were extraordinary accidents, but you just can't get away from that sense of responsibility and that sense to want to make sure you are connecting with and making sure those that are left behind, the loved ones of those that we've lost, are being properly looked after, being cared for, are getting the answers to the questions that they're seeking, making sure, absolutely, you mentioned the funerals and the memorial service and those sorts of things, and those little toddlers, you know, baby Charlotte and Harley and Sam's little child is not due to be born until May of this year. We absolutely owe it to those kids to know that their dads were absolute heroes. They didn't leave them. They didn't go away. They were out there doing something pretty remarkable in the community for the want of nothing in return, but to make a difference. And that's why I said the things I said, because it's 100% true. They were very special people, and they only left their kids behind because they were heroes to our nation, heroes to our communities.
Mm. Oh, Shane, I feel like I could speak to you all day, and this is such a message that I think so many of us need to hear right now, because, you know, in everything that you've just said, it is about none of us are immune to our own childhood, what happens in our childhood, our own losses, our own adversity, that life will happen to us all. But it is how we, and I guess, lean into it, as you were saying, making that decision of whether or not you were in the right job, but that we can only be part of the solution rather than walking away from it. But there is a vulnerability and a very sense of being real that has to come with this, because putting yourself in that position means that you are going to be confronted with emotional situations that most would walk away from, and most would try and avoid at all cost. So again, I go back to the fact that you are moving into the role that you are in terms of Resilience New South Wales, and the need to have those conversations and to have people like yourself talking in that way, I think brings hope and faith to communities, because we need to be having these conversations. Really, none of us are immune to life happening to us and being confronted by that. And we as a society don't talk enough about loss, I believe, as we try to shield ourselves from that. But as you rightfully said, as you start to answer that question, we all experience loss at some point in our life. It is a given that we will deal with it. And I think having that conversation is incredibly, incredibly important. And now when we're looking at, you know, the situation with COVID-19, and there's this forced new way of being and communicating and connecting with each other, that is bringing up a lot of anxiety, rightfully so, for people about not just the here and now, but what their future is going to look like, whether that's economically or from a very real concern about their own health or health of their loved ones, and the stress that that's actually causing people. In terms of where KidsXpress sits with very focused obviously on children's mental health, but what this actually means for children in the future, for those leaders, which I believe we're all being called to lead at the moment, whether you're a leader in a business or you're leading from home and you're trying to lead at work and at home, all from home, how would you advise those leaders in terms of their mental health? What do we as leaders need to make sure that we do, even if it's on a daily basis, to make sure that we can be as mentally as well and lead appropriately at this time?
Wow. I'll backtrack a little bit. I'll backtrack a little bit and try and answer this, and if I get it wrong, pull me back in. So loss and anxiety are very real, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it. We shouldn't be concerned about feeling unhappy, feeling sad, feeling anxious, and those sorts of things. I think the most difficult things I've done in my career is standing up at those funerals and engaging with families who have lost loved ones. And even my own predisposition to that week, with the enormity of all the firefighting event, in the week before we had the tragedy of losing Andrew and Jeff, my grandmother had tragically and suddenly just passed away. So it was only 2 days before that accident that we had her funeral, and I was asked to do the eulogy at her funeral. So the engagement with loss and the dealing with loss happens to us all in different ways. And that's what I meant a little bit earlier about, we're always at different states in life. Every individual is different. Now nobody except my family really knew that I'd just come from my own, you know, really sad, deeply personal loss of my nan, who I was very close to. And she died very unexpectedly and suddenly because she had a fall, which was unexpected. So it wasn't even like we were planning for the loss. So I just finished the eulogy there, which was very difficult, and catching up with family, juggling work. So I'm saying that for a couple of reasons. We're all at a different state before we're confronted with the next challenge or the next thing that presents us with with loss or grief. And so we're already in a different state of mind before we come in to work out how to do it. So my answer to that is, I think, backpedaling a little bit to your question, similarly during the fire season, I bumped into a lot of people unrelated to the firefighting effort who were impacted by the fire. So I go to recovery centres, I'd go to evacuation centres, I'd go to relief centres, and catching up with people that have just lost everything. They've lost their home, they've lost loved ones, and they're extremely emotional, they're very drained. And catching up with them and shaking hands and having a hug and shedding a tear, there's nothing wrong with that. And what I would say and look, don't get me wrong, I used to think there was something really wrong, because I grew up in an era where young boys and young men, you didn't cry about those sorts of things. Crying was a weakness, all that sort of thing. Well, as I've grown up a little bit more and learnt a little bit more, the reality is that's all the wrong thing. We've got to understand and appreciate the fragility of life, the vulnerability of life, and that things go wrong and things happen. And if we can't talk about that, if we can't share that and socialise our thoughts and our feelings about why things are troubling us and why things are concerning us, then we're putting ourselves on the back foot straight away. And the people that kids go to, and from my own experience, the thing that kids need really is to be able to go to their loved ones, to go to their siblings, to their mums and dads, to their carers, to their guardians, to their nans and pops. They're the people that let them know it's okay to feel sad. They're the people that let them know that sharing your emotions and talking about what's troubling you, talking about honestly about what's happening, why it's happening, where to from here, what's next. And it's also about giving, I think, assurance and confidence that it's okay to be feeling that way, but also providing hope and confidence that going forward, things will get better. We'll come out of this, and that's not about false hope. That's actually about candor. It's actually about honest, relatable conversations that say, this is really tough right now. We're not alone in feeling this way. We're not alone in struggling to deal with this. But individually and collectively together, we will get through this. The only way we can do that about having honest, open conversations where people can feel comfortable, they can feel without judgment, that they're not going to be judged because they're feeling a different way. And just because I'm feeling a certain way and you're not, doesn't make me right and you wrong, or you right and me wrong. It's actually about making sure we share, that we see things through different lenses, from different perspectives, and how it affects us is different. And the little things that might upset me would be of no concern whatsoever to my brother or to my sister or to my mum or my dad or whatever. So understanding that and saying it's okay to have a conversation. And I think also now, particularly while we've got these restrictions on and we're all being, told to bunker down and stay at home to assist with the virus and what have you, now more than ever before is this ability to connect and catch up with loved ones, catch up with family, catch up with good friends and what have you, and have conversations, lighten up the mood, enjoy the banter, have the conversations, do a bit of study, get frustrated at this question or that question, you don't understand it, try and normalise that interaction in an unusual or different way, which is so unnormal because we're used to being social, we're used to being inclusive, we're used to shaking hands and sharing hugs and those sorts of things. And it's tough right now. It's really difficult to live and work like that right now, but we can do it. We can do it, and we will do it as long as we're open and honest with each other, and being unashamed of the fact that we're struggling to understand something, or we're struggling to comprehend something, or we're just not feeling right. And it's okay not to feel right. And everyone's response to any particular challenging situation is okay, as long as we work through it and understand it, because we're all going to react differently. We're all a bit weird in our own way, we're all really good in our own way, and it all comes together and is really important. Yeah. But the key to that is sharing, communicating honestly, and appropriately, not dismissively, not in an alarmist way, but a sensible, meaningful, purposeful conversation that can be honest and open.
Yeah, I cannot agree with you more. anybody that's watching this interview that knows me knows that I am a hugger. So you get one handshake from me and then you get a hug. And I'm struggling with that bit at the minute in terms of being able to connect with people that in that way, and realizing now is the time for us to stay at home, to be safe and to be well. But really importantly, rather than, I think that social distancing, it's that physical distancing, but we now actually need to keep connected more than ever. And
Margo, so sorry if I interrupt.
That's right.
You've picked up on a really important point there, and it is called social distancing, right? That's what it's called. That's what we're all doing, but we don't want it to be social distancing. We want to be socially connecting, but in different ways, using tools and devices and mechanisms to maintain that social connectedness, to maintain that social togetherness and inclusion as best we can, without what's normal and what we're used to doing. So it is about physical distancing. It is about separation to help us stop the spread and to save lives and protect our loved ones and protect those the most vulnerable in our community. So it's got a real meaning to it.
Yes.
But the social distancing connotation almost has a perverse or an unintended consequence, because we don't want to be socially isolated. No. We don't want loneliness and separation to become the dominant features. We want people to be sensible, to be safe, to be cared for, caring for each other, connecting with each other. It's a tough language, but what you're saying is 100% right, but it is, we have to be social as much as we can in this strange way.
We even at KidsXpress, Shane, because we deliver therapy in our programs, normally face-to-face at the grassroots, etc. When we then realised with COVID descending upon us, we very quickly, like most businesses, pivoted, and now our therapists and our trauma-informed consultants are actually working with our kids and parents and carers, etc., online. And it's working. And I think the need to adapt, etc., was incredibly important, so that we didn't become socially isolated from each other. And so I think that has ramped up. And I'm thrilled to see how so many people are embracing that. Hence our interview on Zoom. Which also then brings me to the quote I heard you say at the beginning of the year. I think the quote went, "I've spent more time with the Premier than my wife over the last few months." And we're now in a situation where everybody's spending a lot more time with their loved ones than what they're used to, or maybe they want to at this point. And so again, being leaders and thinking around how you're now in this forced situation with the people that you love. And I am going to acknowledge those people who may not feel safe in their homes.
Absolutely.
And I do acknowledge that is a very, very real thing for many people and many children. But given we're in the situation where people are spending more time together and having to communicate, but with somebody like yourself who has the responsibilities that you have in your role and going into your new role, but also your responsibilities as a husband and a father, how do you leave work at work? And importantly, how do you have the conversations around what's happening in the world with your family, with your daughters?
Well, that's a very good question again. So the one good thing about my family, well, there's many good things, but one of the greatest things about my family, and particularly during this last bushfire season crisis that we went through day after day. I mean, I was gone very early in the morning. They didn't see me. They weren't out of bed by the time I left, and often they were in bed by the time I got home. But when I was home, the minute I walked in the door, they reminded me that, it was a real leveler. I wasn't in charge of a thing when I got home. I couldn't speak any authority, and as I said to one of the people recently, the only thing I was responsible for when I got home late at night was making sure the dishwasher was stacked correctly and cleaned up and that was turned on. So it's a really good leveler when I get home. And as a matter of fact, I'm happy to talk about work when I get home, but so often I'm really not wanting to talk about work. It's actually more about what have they been up to, what's the latest thing, what's the trash on TV, all those sorts of normal things that happen. But as a family, my daughters now are 19 and 22, so I've got to keep reminding myself that they're young, independent women. But as they were growing up, we always had a family focus that nothing was off limits. We would always talk about anything that was on their minds, and my daughters, particularly if I was traveling a lot with work, they would have conversations with their mum, with my wife Lisa, and it was okay because we would always share those sorts of things. So if there was something particular going on, they'd say, "Oh, well, look, I'll let Dad know when he gets home." So we were always trying to share and be open about the things that were going on, what it meant in life, trying to be as extremely objective and balanced as we could on whatever the topical things were on the news. And I remember a wonderful phase when they were at primary school. They had a teacher who would pull out news clippings on the day and get the kids to try and read a news clipping, and they would all talk about it, what it meant, because a lot of kids weren't connected with the news. And then they would go home, and I was blown away when my primary school child came home and she was talking about the news, and I'm going, "Where have you got this from?" So we've always tried to maintain that, and wherever possible, try and have dinner around the kitchen table sort of thing. So that was a good time to try and have a conversation and what have you. So I've tried to be authentic in my private life as much as I'm authentic in my business life or in my role in the organisation. So I don't have to pretend to be somebody different at home as I am in the workplace or as I am in the volunteer organisation. The old philosophy of what you see is what you get. Don't look for anything because it's not hidden. You know, that's the approach I tend to take. But differentiating between work and home, particularly in my role in a volunteer organisation, it's very hard because I'm often doing 6 and 7 days a week right throughout the year, because you've got the business to run as a large government department during the week. You've got all your 9 to 5 business and your governance and all that sort of thing. But because it's 99% volunteers, 72,000 of them, you're connecting right across the state all the time at meetings, at events, at celebrations, at openings and medal ceremonies. So a lot of weeknights, a lot of weekends. So I've been very fortunate with a very patient and a very understanding family that I was away a lot, but I was on the phone a bit, and I'd get home as much as I can. But in so many ways, I've been very fortunate to have a very understanding family that I'm away a lot. And when I'm home, and I try and disconnect from work, even though the phone's on 24 hours a day, and I take phone calls at all sorts of weird hours.
Mm.
Mm.
So
did that answer I don't know if that answered the question though. What was the question?
No, you're brilliant.
Oh, there you go.
I'm going to get to the final question, which is really about, given where the world is at and KidsXpress's focus and concern about children's mental health and their well-being, and knowing that we are going to come out the other side of this. This too shall pass. We will get through COVID-19 and there will be an out the other side. I'm curious to what you think, given all those things that you just spoke about, your family around having dinner together and having real conversations and etc. What sort of world do you think our children are going to have out the other side of just this year, just 2020?
Oh, look, I think for everybody we're going to have a different world, and I'll backtrack a little bit. I remember back in 2013, we had major fires in the Blue Mountains. We had in one afternoon 200 homes were destroyed in the lower Blue Mountains around the Winmalee area, and once the fires were under control, there was a couple of visits that came to the area, and there was some royalty that came. We had Princess Mary and Edward from Denmark came out, and we had, Will and Kate came out. All sorts of dignitaries came to visit, and there was a bit of cynicism around that visit. And I remember catching up. There always is with those sorts of things in society, but I remember very vividly a lovely conversation I had with some grandmothers who were on the street with their grandchildren. There was a couple of girls and a little boy, and they just loved the fact that these visitors were in their street, walking around their neighbourhood, even though they'd lost their homes and their neighbours and their friends had lost their homes. But when these little kids were out there saying hello to these special guests, the grandma said to me, "Shane, never let anybody dismiss the importance of these visits, because through these visits, what our grandchildren can do now is when they go back to school after these fires is talk about something other than the damage, the destruction and the despair." So what I think going out of this bushfire season, out of out of this terrible cleanup that is the drought, the bushfires, and now the COVID-19 outbreak is, what is the story? What is the angle that we've learned, that we've gleaned from our changed circumstances over these couple of months that we can share and talk about with our friends, with our mates at school, with our teachers, not losing sight of the fact and not being insensitive or disrespectful in any way to those that have suffered loss, those that have lost loved ones, that have lost their homes. There's plenty of people as we speak that are still living or sheltering in emergency accommodation, that are in alternative accommodation while they work out how to rebuild and where to start with rebuilding their homes or their livelihoods or their farms. So this isn't about being dismissive of the very real fact that there's a lot of damage and despair and devastation out there, but the COVID-19 is a leveler like no other. No one's immune. No one's immune from the impact of trying to work through this awful pandemic. So coming out the other side, we know that life is going to be different for lots of people, and in some way for everybody. Business engagement, schooling, interaction with families, interaction with neighbours. We're going to be changed people, but the reality is we've got to look for those connections. We've got to look for the positives. We've got to reflect on what was challenging, why it was challenging, and there's no doubt. I've already seen, even with my own family, sitting around on weekends, we're playing more board games, we're playing more things to pass the time, and I think what we will find, and I'm optimistic by nature, but I am generally optimistic that as we get through this time, as difficult as it has been, there'll be loads of stories where there'll be some funny yarns, there'll be some funny stories, there'll be some great times, there will be some special times and precious times where we've been able to connect with our family, where we've been able to see a different side to mum and dad or a different side to our siblings. And, they might have frustrated us enormously because we can get away from them, but you know what, we learned something. So there'll be lots of good stories, and I know that's not universal for everybody. There'll be challenges, there'll be tough times, there'll be, as you say before, I think some people will be living in fear and there's real concerns in that space. But coming out the other side, I think there is the reality, I think, that things will be different, where our basic approach to hygiene will be different. Our basic approach to movement will be different. Being mindful of how serious, a virus can be and not being dismissive of basic sanitation, hand washing, those sorts of things. So I think physically, structurally with the economy, structurally with business and working from home and flexibility, I think there will be some changes. There'll be lots more online learning with kids and that sort of thing. But at the core of it is going to be our memories. It's going to be our experiences. It's going to be the stories we share. It's going to be the stories we tell. It's going to be our want to catch up and reconnect with our mates, reconnect with our friends and our extended family and loved ones and all those sorts of things. And I think that's what we've got to look forward to when we start seeing the release of so many of these restrictions and a return to life post-COVID-19, as long as that might be. And we've got to brace ourselves that there'll be some adjustments and there'll be some changes to our lives for many, many months.
Absolutely.
If that makes sense.
Oh, it makes total sense. Yeah. I think the reality that dawns on me quite often is that we are living through a time, and I'll go back to the very beginning, talk about unprecedented, that we are living in a times that writes history, and we're all part of that history, and we all have a responsibility in that history making. And as you say, that history making, part of that is the storytelling and the memories that get shared and those experiences. And I think, from our point of view, making sure our children feel safe and connected is about that sharing of the ball games or the memories and the storytelling, and that they right now are part of history making. And so all our behaviours and our choices right now create what history is actually going to talk about. And I think that's really important for our children to know that these are our times, unprecedented, but these are our times.
Absolutely. And sorry. No, and I would say, one of the things we're really proud of in the RFS is our cadet program. We've got a schools cadet program where we see, the last time I looked at the figures, somewhere around about 900 cadets graduate from school every year. It's a fantastic program. And what I see is, I see inspiration and I see hope and I see confidence that in all our young people, they are the leaders of tomorrow. And when I see the energy, when I see the positivity, when I see the cheekiness and the boldness come through, I'm actually really impressed. I'm really pleased to see how adept they are with technology, how good they are at working with each other, how socially connected they are with each other, because they are the leaders of tomorrow. They are our community of tomorrow. And as you say, telling these stories, the kids of today that are experiencing what we've been going through for the last 6 months, the last 12 months, and however many months follows with this COVID-19, they'll be telling their kids, they'll be telling their grandkids when they get older, don't you tell me about what's going on. Back in 2019, 2020, we lived through this. And it's so true that this is what I remember talking to my grandparents and my great-grandparents about, how they actually had to come through the Depression, and we were so ungrateful because we didn't know, we wanted everything tomorrow, and they had to make everything and refurbish everything and repair everything. Whereas the era today just seems to replace everything because it's time to get a new one. So whatever that looks like in the decades ahead, the kids of today are going to be sharing the stories with their kids and their grandkids and their family networks and their friends networks, and they'll be saying, I remember when this, you don't know how hard you had it. We had it through 2019, 20. And I think that is true.
Yes, I totally agree with you. I'm almost dreading it a little bit, but I think it is so incredibly true. And I think such an important note to kind of end on, in terms of, we will get through this. There's
Absolutely.
going to be there's going to be hard times, there's going to be good times, but how we communicate with each other now, with all our vulnerability and everything that we are, is going to actually sustain our future and our children. So Shane, I just want to say to you, I know that through this period of time, and particularly this year, I know that lots of people have thanked you for everything that you've done, and no doubt everything you're about to do. I'd like to say these two things, and one is from our children, from the children that KidsXpress supports, but from children all across Australia. They have such deep gratitude for you being as brave as you are. And it does take a brave human being to do what you do and the way you do it. Your humility shows them a leadership and a way of being that our children will always aspire to. So from our children, we thank you. From KidsXpress and your new role moving into Resilience New South Wales, and with the expertise we have around children's mental health and supporting children, we are at your service if you feel that we can help in any way. I did mention to you at the beginning, before we went on, that we've got support from our foundations, the Tony Foundation, to support bushfire communities in particular. But if in your new role, in terms of resilience, etc., you believe there's a role for KidsXpress to play, we will be there.
Oh, that's lovely. And if I can respond to that by saying this last 6 months, I cannot tell you how many cards, notes, drawings, pictures that I've received, that we've received as a firefighting team from kids right across Australia and from all different parts of the globe, putting their words together, putting their notes together, acknowledging, thanking, sharing their views on how they saw the fires, how they experienced the fires, whether they were frightened, whether they were proud, whether they were grateful. It didn't matter. There's something so truly special about the rawness, about the authenticity of kids' language when it comes to writing those notes and writing those cards and putting their drawings together. So kids that might not be good with words, they can do pretty good drawings as well. And I would say to all the kids, never underestimate the influence you have on being able to share stories, share information, share how you're feeling, that makes a difference to adults, to your mum and dad, to your family network, but to strangers. And through this fire season, one of the most profound things that I remember, we took photocopies of a lot of those little notes that we got from school kids, whether they were for primary school, preschool, or indeed more mature kids in high school. We actually photocopied a lot of those notes. And when we had all our catering teams packing up the lunches and the dinners that were sent out to the firefighters in the field or to the people working at staging areas or remote areas, the amount of times that firefighters have said to me and posted it on social media, there was something very powerful, there was something very special that kept them going because they saw these notes from kids. Never underestimate kids, how much of a difference you make to the society, to the community, and to the adults in your world. What you've got to offer is really important, it's really genuine, and it makes a really big difference. And to KidsXpress and Margo, I would say to you, absolutely in this new role around resilience, I can see a very logical fit to make sure we maintain connection and we maintain working together. And I promise you this, when I finally do catch up with you, I'll be happy to share a hug.
Well, I look forward. You might be the first person I hug, Shane, so be warned.
I look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Shane. It's been an absolute delight. And yeah, we will no doubt have that hug sometime in the future.
Oh, thank you, and I look forward to it.
Take care.